talking a little bit more about crypto, there's one character in the WorldCom story who every time I read about them, I'm like, this person would have been great if they were becoming a young working professional during the crypto era, and that's Jack Grubman. Can you talk a little bit about his role in WorldCom and in the WorldCom stock and what he was up to during this period?
Sure. So Jack Grubman was one of the primary analysts in the telecom industry. And we have to talk about the super banks while we're talking about Jack Grubman. So what happened, these super banks like Citibank, for example, that on one side of the house, you had the investment bankers. On the other side of the house, you had the commercial bankers. And then you had, when Solomon Smith Barney was acquired, you had the analyst. So Jack Grubman followed WorldCom stock, and he, until the bitter end, basically told people, load up the truck, buy as much of the stock as you can. Well, we talked about a little bit about Bernie Ebbers and the loans he took out. He went to Citibank on the commercial side to take out a lot of his loans, put his stock up or stock options as collateral. And then on the other side of the house, the investment banking side, they were making, tens of millions of dollars in advising WorldCom on acquisitions. Jack Grubman, who's touting the stock, think about all those conflicts of interest. If the stock price starts going down on the commercial side of the house, then their loan is at risk. There's supposed to be a wall there. Right, an invisible wall. But obviously he had an incentive to keep the stock price high. And back when, I think it was the Glass-Steagall Act, right, that actually broke up the super banks, and then it was rolled back, and now we have those conflicts again.
And in the crypto world, we've got our analogs, right? I've noticed on Twitter lately some good work from Zach XBT and Bitfinex and others like that who are pointing out that there are promoters out there who are shilling coins and privately, without anybody knowing, selling high. What's the difference between that and a boiler room penny pump and dump scheme? You tell me. Jack Grubman, the problem is he had his incentives wrong. He had every incentive to keep saying this is going to go up so that his bank can keep making the fees, as do these crypto promoters have an incentive to keep the good news coming because they hold those coins and they have that power. In order to be a whistleblower, you don't have to be an insider. You can be an expert. You can have that technical knowledge as long as you have what's called original information. And that can mean that you have looked very carefully at something, you've done your sleuthing, and you've come up with information that's not really out there. You need to put the puzzle together. That can be a whistleblower. That's the Bernie Madoff whistleblower. That's what he did, right? He figured out that there was a fraud going on there by putting together somewhat arcane information and applying his technical skills and brought it to light.
In a closer comparison than even just the promoters, which is a clear, more or less a one-to-one to what you guys were just discussing, we also have entities in cryptocurrency like Cumberland Global and a handful of others. They function as like the same way you're talking about the super banks. They function as like, we're going to market make. Also, we're going to invest. Also, we're going to have an exchange like FTX and Alameda. We're going to have our hands in every single cookie jar. And ultimately, like BitMEX, it was proven they were trading against their customers. Like these guys had access to the order books and they could trade against their own customers and front run them and spoof and do whatever it took to liquidate their own customers. It just seems like such an obvious like, oh, well, that's a problem.
And to me, that's the vanguard of enforcement in the crypto industry. It has just started to happen. So we're going to see more cases on market manipulation, more cases on insider trading. And whether that market manipulation is just as you described, whether it's front running or spoofing or wash trading, that's where the SEC is going. To this point, the SEC and the CFTC as well have really focused on offering unregistered securities or out and out thefts. Those have been the two sort of low hanging fruit that they've gone after. And now we're starting to see changes, of course, with the insider trading case, the Coinbase case, and just last week, the hydrogen technology case, which is a case that involves a sort of wash trading, a sort of spoofing, but basically where a programmer was hired to pump and dump a certain amount of coin that was released by Hydrogen, allegedly, although that programmer has now agreed to a settlement. That's an interesting case. It's a little more complicated. And I think all of those things that you refer to, Cass, which I think, yeah, to some extent, there's been a blind eye turned to them. I don't think that's going to happen anymore. I think the regulators are saying, hey, there's a real problem here, and we've addressed it in traditional financial markets, but now we have to bring that over to crypto.
We want to minimize regulators having to chase down fraudsters and criminals, right? That's totally inefficient. We want smart, balanced policy that allows for transparency, for some attestation or assurance over, metrics that are really important to society and the public, while at the same time allowing room for innovation of new technologies.
Besides these comparisons, which I think are valid, I think the more direct comparison between someone like Jack and cryptocurrency are like the cryptocurrency researchers who are heavily invested in cryptocurrency, or who even will do some angel or VC investing while still publishing protocol research reports and stuff. Sometimes when you hear them talk, it reminds me a little bit of Jack's brazenness, where he was writing in emails that his upgrade of AT&T that he did was a business deal in his mind to get his kids into this preschool that the AT&T executive could. And that when the Wall Street Journal started reporting on some of Jack's conflicts of interest, he said to New York Magazine, the reality of the world is that analysts are becoming increasingly important in the banking practice of firms, not just for underwriting, but also for mergers and acquisitions. It just is what it is. It's part of the business. He also said once, when challenged as to whether or not he could remain objective, his response was objective? ? The other word for it is uninformed. He embraced the conflict of interest, and Cass and I have both experienced in cryptocurrency. There are certain researchers and certain people who believe that if you are not heavily invested, if you're not invested in these protocols, you're actually biased against them in some way, and that the only way to truly be informed about these things is to have these massive investments. And so when I look at a case like Jack, I just see that echoed so often across research done by analysts in this industry currently.
Yeah, that's a great point. And you just made me think about the conflicts of interest that existed with the public accounting firms back in the day, with Enron and WorldCom, where Arthur Andersen was making the bulk of their money on consulting practice. And what happened was the external audit really became the loss leader. A lot of these big firms started staffing their engagements with, less experienced auditors, doing less and less what's known as detailed substantive testing, where they would pull transactions and then look at the support. So, for example, Arthur Andersen only vouched 10 capital additions in the first half of the year and none in the second half, based on their reliance of the company's internal controls. So these firms would heavily rely on internal controls. And Andersen, for example, would come into the audit committee meetings with what we called the red, yellow, green light report. It was, literally for every area within finance, we give it a green light. Controls are strong. And based on our reliance of controls, then we're going to really reduce our testing. So there are all these conflicts. They also shared too much with management. The methodologies of the firms really, in many cases, did not at that time allow them to root out some of these collusive frauds that we've seen. So Andersen, for example, told management, hey, we're coming in to test this particular area, which is where some of these fraudulent entries resided. And management quickly went in and moved them out, spread them across a multitude of fixed asset accounts as smaller dollar entries, because they knew that Andersen did not test amounts below $50 million. The same thing happened in HealthSouth. HealthSouth made hundreds of thousands of entries, capitalizing operating expenses, but instead of making a few larger entries like WorldCom, they made them below $4,000 because they knew that the external audit didn't test below that threshold. So too much sharing of information with the client, consulting as a conflict. Andersen actually, in their work papers, documented that WorldCom was a high-risk client, but they didn't change their audit procedures based on that. And they identified capitalization of operating expense as a potential fraud threat in their work papers. They were required to ask about these on-top post-close entries. So management would close the books and then they would make these fraudulent entries on top. And instead of going into the accounting system and pulling out these entries, they could have done that. They asked management whether there were any of the on-top entries. Of course, management said no, and they documented that in their working papers. So we're in a totally different place today than we were 20 years ago in terms of audit quality, I think, and the firms making sure that they are testing smarter, not harder. And with technology, you can go in and pull out, like Cass, we talked about round dollar amounts. I mean, there are all types of odd entries that you can go in and easily pull out. However, I will say that independence is an area that I have been reading a lot about lately, and there's a big push with the firms that, saying they need to beef up their independence because they are building their consulting practices back up.
Yeah, Francine McKenna talked about that recently when she was on the show, about how that was initially stopped and has gradually become more and more common again.
I agree with him because I have friends who consulted at KPMG, I think. He was going to become a lawyer. Like, his job profile did not match up with what he was doing over at an auditing firm. And yet, like, he was like, this is an important job for me. Like, this is a good stepping stone for me. And I was just like, oh, wow, that's not what you would think an auditing firm would be pushing. But yeah, here we are.
And we now have the PCAOB, which is basically, auditing the auditors, so to speak. Back in the days of WorldCom and Enron, the public accounting firms were self-regulated, and that didn't work very well. So self-regulation, I mean, we see time and time again, it doesn't work well. You need some smart, balanced regulation and oversight.